Good evening, everybody. Let's get started. It's a beautiful evening, and we want to get you out of here in time to be able to enjoy it. I am very happy to welcome you to an impromptu webinar this evening on the annual Snapshot, which was released by the Agency of Education a week and a half ago. And it's a tool that's available for school board members as well as administration and the general population to help us understand how we're doing. So before we get started, just a couple of technical pieces. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Holson, the Director of Education Services at VSBA. I'm joined this evening by Carrie Lamb, our Director of Operations.
Hello, everyone.
Carrie is on the line in case of any technical difficulties, and she'll also be monitoring the questions as they come in. We're also joined this evening by a guest from the Agency of Education, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. I just want to cover, for those of you who have not joined us for webinars in the past, we always welcome questions and your comments. We have all of the microphones muted so we don't hear your dogs barking or your kids playing or your dishes as you're washing them after dinner. So please use the question box, type in your questions. We'll answer them in real time as they appear, or we'll cluster them to obvious times for breaks in the content. After the webinar closes, you'll be sent a link to a 3-question evaluation. We very much welcome your input and your feedback. It's what makes us get better at what we do to support you. Tomorrow, or maybe it'll be Wednesday, you'll get an email from us with a link to the video of tonight's webinar and any additional materials that we covered tonight. Thereafter, you can find the archived version on YouTube, our YouTube channel, which is also hosted on our website. So you'll have plenty of access to these materials after this evening. So our guest this evening is Patrick Halliday. He is the Director of Education Quality Division at the Vermont Agency of Education. And he's really been the one who's headed up the Annual Snapshot project to date. Previously, he was a project manager helping to create the ESSA state plan, from which, of course, the snapshot grows. He taught upper elementary students for many years and was a former commissioner and chair of the Burlington School Board. He lives in Burlington with his wife, who is on the faculty at UVM in the elementary education department, and his 3 children also, 2 of whom are now away at college, and he's coping with that as the 3rd one is still at home. So welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about the annual snapshot. Just a little bit of background on this. I'm hoping people can see my screen right now. Let me click on show my screen. There we go. All right, hopefully folks can see my screen right now. Versions of this presentation, we gave this around the state back the 3rd week of June, largely for superintendents, principals, curriculum directors, and similar. I think we did 8 of those in different locations across the state, as well as a couple of media trainings too, so the media was able to get a little bit of an understanding of what this is. So I really appreciate the chance also to make this presentation to school board members across the state. And then finally, additionally, I just wanted to say that this is a webinar, and we'll certainly do our best to answer all those questions that come up. But I want to extend the invitation at the outset that if anyone has a lot of questions and would like to talk about this in further detail, please feel free to reach out to me. We can set up a time to do it. And if there is a desire, I'm sure we can discuss making a way finding a way to even make these presentations to individual boards. like I said, if there's a desire. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in to this conversation. And I want to talk by saying the Annual Snapshot is a tool. It is one tool, and we think it is a good tool right now. It's going to be a better tool over the course of the next 6 months, and it'll be even a better tool 18 months now out from now. But it's not the only tool. We're going to talk about this right now, but I don't want to give the impression that this is the only thing that schools should be using to assess their quality and to look at what they're doing well, to look at what they need to be doing better. But it's one tool that hopefully should start. We'd like to start these presentations as much as possible by a graphic that looks something like this. And the annual snapshot and the integrated field reviews you'll see in the middle, but I think the most important things are what bookend that is, the education quality standards and continuous improvement. And the education quality standards were developed now about 5 years ago by the State Board of Education and really defined what good teaching and learning looks like in Vermont. The annual snapshot is a quantitative way of assessing the education quality standards. For those board members and those schools who have gone through an integrated field review, you'll know that every 3 years, a team from the Agency of Education facilitates a conversation throughout the supervisory union or district. It's really led by other educators, by peers who are hosting those conversations and organized by the Agency of Education. But I think the logic of this is that we have these standards. The state has a couple of different ways that we can help to assess what's going well and where there can be some improvement in those standards. And it's all in service of continuous improvement. So the goal is really to identify those areas that a school can get better. All schools can get better, and just like all teachers will tell you that, there's not a student in their classroom who cannot do better than he or she is already doing. And the same with schools. All schools have strengths, all schools have needs, and the annual snapshot and the integrated field review are two ways that the state can help schools to identify that. And I also want to say that there are lots of local ways. There are comprehensive local assessment systems that exist, as well as lots of anecdotal and other quality data that your local schools are having. And I don't in any way, this presentation doesn't dismiss those. The annual snapshot is a way to help focus that, though. I think it's important to understand a little bit about where the Every Student Succeeds Act came from. The Every Student Succeeds Act is the federal law that was passed back in 2015. And it's really the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was a War on Poverty, Great Society program that came out of the Johnson administration. Most people are most familiar, at least most recently, with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as its previous incarnation, which was No Child Left Behind. ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, is the most recent reauthorization of that. And I think that it's important to talk about this because it's really, this was born as the way for the federal government to become involved in public education. The government doesn't actually, the US Constitution makes no reference to education. And so the way that the government became involved in education is to get money to schools to help to support kids who are, at this time, really the kids in poverty. And that's really the genesis of this law. And the way that the snapshot works, which is an outgrowth of this law, is really to draw attention to where those gaps exist to help schools better understand how they can spend those money. One additional thing I should have said at the outset is, please, listening to me talk for an hour may not be the most enjoyable thing on a beautiful Monday evening. So I think that it's important to have this as much of a conversation as we can in this forum. So I really urge you, if there are any questions that you have, to go ahead and enter those, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can as we go through. All right, so what is the snapshot designed to do? As I mentioned before, it's to reflect the education quality standards, the goals that are laid out in those standards, and to identify strength and needs. Ultimately, it's going to provide, we hope, a much more holistic view of school systems than we saw under No Child Left Behind. Although the version that we're seeing today is really our first release of this, and there are going to be more data that's going to be coming out and broader data in subsequent releases, which we'll talk about later on. It's really also intended to reduce the reporting burden for schools and supervisory unions. We hope, and I think we've succeeded in this, and really and asking very little additional for schools, and in fact, taking quite a bit of the reporting burden off. In the past, every school had to come up with its own report card. This version that we have right now will help to address that, and so schools don't have to do that. We've really made that for them. And then, as I mentioned before, with the reference back to the Johnson administration, this is really intended to hone in on equity and to really draw attention to where gaps in performance between our historically marginalized and our historically privileged students exist. Not to blame the schools, but just to call attention. So if you don't know that there's a problem, it's hard to address it. And this is really just to draw attention to that problem so that the schools can be creative and thoughtful in how they want to address it. And thinking as a board member, so that you understand which students are not succeeding at the same rate as other students, so that you can ask those questions of the superintendents and of those school systems as you go forward. And the final thing I want to mention, and I can talk about this quite a bit later in the presentation if folks are interested, there are some limited federal supports that come to some of the schools, and this is eligibility for what we're calling comprehensive and equity schools. And comprehensive schools, these are defined under the Every Student Succeeds Act, are the 5% of schools who are most in need of support will be getting some additional financial as well as human capital resources. And then equity schools are schools that have had persistent gaps, large and persistent gaps between one or more historically marginalized populations and their more historically privileged peers.
Patrick, can I just interrupt for one quick second and ask you if you have any suggestions to school board members on how we can help make sure that our communities understand the purpose and the best utility for this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that you'll see as we get a little bit further in, we have a logic, a hierarchy of this where we have domains and indicators as a way that the data is organized. I think that the single most important thing to think about is that each of these indicators is kind of a thermometer. It's not a deep analytic. This is a look at what's going on. It's a thermometer to say things look pretty good here, or this is something that we might want to ask a little bit more about. And so for board members and for broader stakeholders, I would say something like, don't ignore when you have a temperature of 101, but there may be lots of reasons for having that temperature too, and ask some questions about it. Or you can have high blood pressure because you have too much salt in your diet, or you can have high blood pressure because you're watching the Women's World Cup game yesterday and you're nervous and excited about what actually might be happening. And so the snapshot doesn't differentiate between to say why something is happening. It's just saying this is what the data as collected through our reporting system suggest, and it's really incumbent upon the schools, upon and all stakeholders in the schools to ask more questions about that, not to jump to conclusions about any things, but say, how come this is showing the way that it is? How come our students in poverty are substantially being outperformed by the students who aren't in poverty? And what are some novel ways that we might be able to address that? Or what additional data do we need to really be able to get an understanding of precisely where those gaps are lying? So I think that's very, very important to look at for the broader public, that this is not meant to be all things to all people, but it's meant to be a series of measuring of blood pressure or temperature or something along those lines. So. And I also want to just say there are a lot of things that the snapshot is not designed to do. By design, it is not meant to rank or compare schools to each other. I can't say that it couldn't be done through this, but it would be very, very difficult to do. It's not meant to take two schools and say, how is school A doing compared to school B? Or I work in Barre, I'm sitting in Montpelier right now. How is Barre doing compared to Montpelier? That's not the intent of this, and it really doesn't lend itself to doing that. And it's also moving away from kind of the blame and shame mentality that we saw a lot in under No Child Left Behind. Instead, it's pointing to continuous improvement and saying, what are the things that we need to do in order to make sure that all students are succeeding? This first version that comes out right now is very heavy in assessment scores. By that, I mean the SBAC, English Language Arts and Math, graduation rates, and the like. As subsequent versions come out, one in September, one another version in December of this year, there'll be a broader list of indicators to really provide a more detailed understanding of what's going on, or at least more detailed places that we might want to look. For example, that we might be looking and saying, well, our math scores are low, we need to get a new math program. That really shouldn't be the response. It's very possible that there's a problem with the math program, but there may be something else. It may be that personalization shows up as something that the school hasn't invested heavily into. And this is really just to say, not just how to improve our math scores, but really to understand more broadly what's going on in the schools. And finally, I think it's really important, as I hope I've made clear, that this does not fully represent a school system. Lots of wonderful things go on in all schools, and with the 20 indicators that we'll ultimately have here, there's no way to fully represent what's going on in a school. So it's good and helpful information, but it's not everything.
So again, can I jump in real quickly?
Please do.
Okay, thanks. I understand that the intent is not to compare school to school, but it is an opportunity for board members and administration to compare or look at other districts that are demographically similar or facing similar challenges or have similar opportunities, to just get a overview of where they fit in that mix. Is that fair?
You certainly can look at other supervisory unions and districts and see, how they're comparing, and you could pull that to compare to to your district. The other is that what's built into this, as we'll see when we get into a little bit of a tour, is the comparison isn't to other schools or other SUs, it's to the state. And so to give an idea of, like, this is what the state performance looks like as a whole. How does your work compare, or how does your performance compare to the state averages?
Sure.
As opposed to other schools? But you certainly can look at, again, I'll use the Montpelier Barre just simply because of where I am geographically. If I can pull up and look at what is going on in the Montpelier school district, and I can look what's going on in the Barre SU, and go back and forth between those screens and make that comparison. And it may be instructive, but I think really it's focusing more intentionally on what is Barre doing well, or what are Barre's needs, and let's address those. What is Montpelier doing well? What is Montpelier's needs? And really let's address those for continuous improvement efforts across the school.
Right, understandable. But the state level data, for example, includes small rural schools like Marlborough and big urban districts like Burlington, and to lump them all together may not be giving the most accurate picture that either of those two districts that I just mentioned
Sure.
really need. So they have access and are able to look at other similar
Absolutely.
data.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's
absolutely.
all I was getting
Yeah,
at.
yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is a little bit of a a tangent from this presentation, but one of the things that's going to be available to schools is this development that comes out of this with these equity supports, is the development of what we're calling networked improvement communities. Well, we're not calling that, they're called networked improvement communities. And it's trying to find schools, whether you're a rural school looking with other rural schools, but if you're a school who has an issue, a challenge that you're trying to meet, and finding the agencies trying to match you, this is voluntary, so this is not something that's required, but match you with other schools that are asking similar sorts of questions, so that those schools can work together, say, here's what we're trying, what are you trying, how are we going to be able to work on these problems together, and we're facilitating those conversations and kind of matching schools that may be asking similar questions, whether it be rural, whether it be based on geography, or just based on demographics, or based on the questions that you're asking. But that's an opportunity that's being presented to superintendents and principals right now. A couple of qualifiers. We're going to take a quick jump into the snapshot itself. That any time we're looking at supervisory union or school level data, it's fake data. For this presentation, it's actually even a fake supervisory union. It's just for what we're looking at right now. And all the data that we have now come from the 17-18 academic year. So when you go on right now, even though the 18-19 academic year just finished, you're looking at 17-18 academic year. The 18-19 academic year, the one that just concluded, that data will be displayed starting in December of this year when we come out with our next version. And then I also just want to clarify, there are actually two different types of reports that ultimately are two different ways that the data looked at. One, for anything that's reporting, we look at if there's the student group of interest is smaller than 11, it's suppressed. You can't see it. It doesn't show up. Similarly, for accountability determinations, that's what I made a brief reference to in the beginning of comprehensive and equity support eligible schools. That has to have a student group of 25 or larger. I can get into that later on, but you'll see in a little bit there'll be a spot where you'll see some locks that will show up on the screen, and that's intentional because the group of interest there is less than 10, is less than 11 students, so it's not displayed, and that's really just to protect student privacy. It also makes for bad statistical data, but the real motivation is to protect student privacy. When you go to the snapshot, this is what the top of the landing page looks like, and some explanations. As you scroll down, I mentioned this a little bit, that we have this kind of hierarchy of our language as we're using it internally. These are 5 different domains. Each domain has a number of indicators, between 3 and 8 indicators, and you can get a rating for each indicator as well as for each domain. And each one of these indicators and domains are rated in 2 different ways. One is, how are you doing this year? That's the performance rating. Are you meeting, not meeting, approaching, exceeding, et cetera? And then the second rating is, how has that performance changed compared to on that same measure in the previous academic year? Has it gone up? Has it stayed about the same? Has it gone up a little bit, or has there been a substantial growth in that? And so we'll see that for each of those. And so come September, every school will have a version that looks like this, where we'll have performance and ratings, both current performance and change, for all 5 of these indicators. What we're going to look at, or if you were to go to the site right now, you only have information on the academic proficiency indicator, and these other are the academic proficiency domain. These other domains are going to be having more data being put into them in September, December. I'll get into that in a little bit as we go forward. Let's see. So let's take a look. So what we're going to do right now is jump in and say this is the, we're looking at the Vermont version. So this is all state data. We're not looking at any individual school, any individual supervisory union. We're looking at this data just at the state level. And so if you click right where our little orange is, you'll get to a version right now that looks like this, that has these, you know, it looks just similar to what we have right now, but with just the academic proficiency. I should say very briefly that you'll see these kind of 4 columns, 2 under performance and 2 under equity index. The 2 under performance is how are you doing this year on this particular domain, and is that better or worse than last year? Under equity index, it's basically asking the question is how big are the gaps between our historically marginalized and our historically privileged students? And we'll just jump in a little bit further. This has, it's built as a dashboard with drill down. So if you were to go to this website, which is live and open, click anywhere in that academic proficiency bubble, what you'd get is all of the different indicators. I know you can't see this right now. I just want to show the array. We're going to focus in a little bit more closely on some of them going forward here. But all of the different indicators are there, and then you'll be able to dig down further into each one of those. So let's take a little bit of a look at this page. At the top, each of the indicators is weighted, and by the law, the ELA, reading SBAC, and math SBAC, and graduation have to have a larger weight than everyone else. You can see that those are the indicators that we're looking at on this page. They have to have a larger weight. I think it's important when you're looking at your own school, however, that it may not, these percentages may or may not be the same. We're looking at the state where we have data for all of these, but one of these is graduation rates. If you're looking at an elementary school, they're not going to have a graduation rate. If you don't have a large number of students with English proficiency, you're not going to have an English proficiency indicator there. And so the percentages then are more or less distributed to those remaining, which means that it really differs by school. But you can also see that these ratings, the English language arts, the graduation rate, and the math are the ones that are going to matter the most. A couple other things you can see over on the right-hand side. You can see a printer. You can print this out. It'll render a PDF if you want to be able to look at that. And then you can also download the data behind it in an Excel sheet if there's an interest in doing that. Looking a little bit down, we're going to take a closer look at the English language arts indicator. Again, this is based on the SBAC, and we'll just dive into that a little bit more. And this is exactly as you're coming to this page, you'd be able to click on that English language arts, dive in a little bit further to take a screen that looks like this. Again, a quick tour looking at kind of in the top middle. Under grade right now, again, this is Vermont data. So we're looking at all grades who take the English language arts SBAC assessment, which is why the all grades is clicked on. You can, if you chose, click on an individual grade. It doesn't show up necessarily as well right here as it might other places, but the grades in which SBAC are not given before 3rd grade and then after 9th grade are grayed out a little bit on this scale, so you wouldn't actually be able to click on those. Under student group, we're looking at all students. And so we're looking at not any particular student group. There is a drop-down menu there where you can pick, I think there are 14 or 15 or 16 different individual student groups based on racial, ethnic identity, poverty, if a student is on an individualized education plan, if a student is homeless or migrant or foster or military affiliated. There may be a couple that I have failed to mention there as well. And then you can also see under the English language arts reading, big green letters, there are some numbers. This represents about 41,000 students across the state who took this assessment back in the 17-18 school year. This particular assessment is a little bit tricky in that there are 2 different ways that it's measured. One is a scale score, which is just how well did the student, what is the average of all student performance for the student group that we're interested in? In the past, we've looked at proficiency rates, but there are a number of problems with proficiency rates. I'd be happy to answer if people have questions about our concerns with proficiency rates, but we're not looking at proficiency rates. We're really looking just at that score and not whether those scores are meeting this, individual student scores are meeting an arbitrary cutoff. And then there's also a growth rate. And that growth rate is a little tricky to understand, but I think the important thing is what this is really looking at is over the course of the last 3 years, how well have individual students improved compared to their peers who scored similarly to them 3 years ago. And so this is a metric that's trying to see how well did an individual school do at supporting the growth of students over the course of the last 3 years. It's a little bit of a complicated statistical measure, and again, I can go into this in more detail and would be happy to do so, but it gets a little bit into the weeds. Statistically, it's very strong. I think the important thing to know is you need 3 years of data. So the first year of growth data that you'll get is 5th grade, because you need 3rd grade SBAC scores and 4th grade SBAC scores and 5th grade SBAC scores to do it. Underneath the current performance is the performance change, and you can see that that is both how much did the scale score change compared to last year. In this case, it shows it was fairly flat. And then how much did that growth score change compared to last year? And for this year, we don't have a growth score change metric. We will have that come December, just because the SBAC hasn't been around long enough to gather enough years of data to do it. Again, I could draw this all out and you would nod and say, oh, okay, I get it at that point. And then I also want to draw attention to the current equity index. This is looking at, since we're looking at the all student group, it's saying how well are our historically marginalized students, which is any student who is on an IEP, is an English learner, is a member of a racial ethnic minority, migrant, a variety of others I mentioned. How well is our students in our historically marginalized group doing compared to our historically privileged group? And this is something that I think school board members in particular might be interested in looking at. We certainly are at the state, not necessarily looking at individual schools, but looking at what our trends are at the state. And what we're seeing, from this data right here, is that there is a big gap between our historically marginalized populations and their peers. It doesn't mean that the schools are to blame. The schools are the recipients of lots of issues that go on in broader society, but it doesn't mean that the schools shouldn't be working to address them. And this is the point of this, to say, where are those gaps and how can we start to work to address them? I'm going to pause right now before I jump into a couple of different things to see if there are any particular questions that have popped up. It's been a whole lot of information in a short amount of time, and I want to be able to make sure we answer those.
We actually do have a question.
Go ahead.
The question is, can you provide the documentation for the methodology for the growth scale?
I can. I'd be happy to do that. And actually, there's a slide that attempts to be a little bit better. That's kind of buried at the end of this if we want to look at it. But it actually comes from some work that a education statistician at Harvard did, a gentleman by the name of Andrew Ho, who's written a book really looking at how to look at growth scores and what methods are the best. If someone would, if you'd like to send me an email, I can give you the exact citation, both from Andrew Ho as well as from a couple of other documents that kind of explain that as well. Again, it gets a little bit weedy, but for those who are interested in those, it's very, very good work. And I think the other thing that is important to know is that having some growth score was more or less required under ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. There were some ways to not provide a growth score, but they became so onerous that it really was much easier to do a growth score that way. Any other questions at this point?
I don't see any.
All right. So I want to, we've been looking at Vermont, for all students in Vermont. We can also drop down in this menu and say, let's look at a particular student group of interest. So in this case, we're looking at free and reduced lunch. So this is any student who's eligible for free and reduced lunch. Under the, again, we're still looking at all grades. We could look at free and reduced lunch for 4th grade or 9th grade or, any of the grades. And you'll see that the number of students is gone from 41,000 to 16,000 students who took that. And if I toggle quickly back and forth, you'll see a little bit of change in the performance. And in this particular case, the growth score has remained steady, but the overall scale score for students on free and reduced lunch is lower than the scale score for students who are not on free and reduced lunch. And that's also reflected in the equity index. In this case, what we're looking at in that equity index is comparing students who are on free and reduced lunch to the performance of students who are not on free and reduced lunch. And in this case, not meeting means the students who are on free and reduced lunch, this is looking specifically at the scale score, the students who are not on free and reduced lunch have are performing lower than those who, I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards. The students who are on free and reduced lunch are performing lower than the students who are not on free and reduced lunch, which is evidence of a gap, which would be evidence, which is evidence for us at the state that this is an issue that we need to dig further into. I just wanted to jump down that we've been looking at the English language arts. There's also math, there's graduation rates, there's for schools that have students who are New American population, English learners, we're looking at progress toward proficiency. One thing that might be of interest to graduation rate is the graduation rate is actually made up of 2 separate measures. One is the 4-year graduation rate and one is the 6-year graduation rate. And so what you see here for this meeting is an averaging of the 4 and 6-year graduation rate for students. And the reason behind that is really the move under Act 77 and the education quality standards to looking at flexible pathways towards graduation. And for some students, the 6-year graduation rate is a better measure than the 4-year graduation rate. So we're including those both as a flexible pathway. We have some additional, this might be of interest to board members. I certainly would have been interested to me when I was on the school board. There are some additional information that's going to be included come December on college and career readiness. There are 2 different indicators. Right now, they're not up and available, but they will be for the first time. This data was collected for the first time in the 18-19 school year and will be reported in December of 19. One is performance on the career and college readiness assessments, and this question is asking, at the point of graduation, what percentage of students have demonstrated proficiency have reached a proficiency cut score with a number of college and career readiness assessments. So that includes an SAT or an ACT score. It can, I think it's a 3 on an AP for students who are taking advantage of the dual enrollment opportunities. It's a C on a C or better in a dual enrollment course. There are also a couple of different ones. The ASVAB, which is a military readiness exam. There's a cut score for the ASVAB that would count toward that. For students who are in career and tech programs, an industry recognized credential or an IRC. The earning of an industry recognized credential would be a demonstration of that. And so this is a way to say, what percentage of students have been able to meet one of those college and career readiness benchmarks? And the second one is looking 16 months after graduation. So we've invested in these students. What are they actually doing? And so we're looking 16 months after graduation to find out what percentage of students are enrolled in a 2 or a 4-year college, are enrolled in a trade school, are employed, and we have a specific definition of employment. It's not just not just a part-time job, but full-time employed. Or we're hoping, we don't have this data yet, but we're working with the military also to see what percentage of students might have enlisted in the military. We know that this particular measure is going to have some problems with it, and this is why we're saying, think of these as thermometers. For example, if you have a student who goes to college in Canada, we're actually not able to track that student's enrollment into Canadian or other colleges overseas, although we can within the United States. Likewise, we're able to track students who are working in Vermont, but if they go across the border to New York or to New Hampshire, we won't have that, or if they go to Texas or California, we won't be able to track that. So we know that there are some problems, but we're thinking with the data that we get for this, but we're hoping that it's going to be better than the data that we have right now. And this is something that schools in particular have really asked us because they don't have a good way of being able to track how their students, what their students' outcomes are after graduation. Honestly, for many schools, something like a Facebook page tends to be the most effective way, which is certainly has its problems with it. And then I'm going to jump ahead here to just look at this slide. And what we're looking at right now, this slide and the one that follows, is kind of the total rollout for all of the different indicators that we have. So we've been looking right now just at the academic proficiency domain, which is that green one, and the one that comes out here, or that just came out a couple weeks ago, really were was just those 5 indicators of ELA and math SBAC scores, a science assessment, which counts very, very, very little this year, but will count more in subsequent years. This was the first year of that science assessment, so we only counted it a small amount. Proficiency, progress toward proficiency for English learners and graduation rate. Come this September, we're going to be adding 5 additional indicators, and they're going to come from the different one at least from each of the different domains. One is going to be looking at the percentage of students who have participated in some sort of flexible pathway in school, and this is in keeping with the Ed Quality Standards in Act 77. We're also going to have some data on teacher licensure and teacher turnover, just knowledge for schools. I would think both of those could be of quite interesting to school boards to know what percentage, for example, the licensed teachers, what percentage of licensed teachers are, or what percentage of the teachers are teaching under an emergency or a provisional license instead of fully licensed. And the education staff stability is how much turnover is there in a 3-year period, what percentage of teachers who were there 3 years ago, and not just teachers, principals, and at the state level superintendents are still with that district. We'll have some data on disciplinary exclusion. Our students, what does the discipline look like? When kids are being expelled for school for disciplinary reasons. And then also we'll have some information on staffing ratios, another one that I think that might be of particular interest to school boards. The Ed Quality Standards sets out some staffing guidelines, and this question is really looking at how well a school or a supervisory union is doing in meeting those staffing guidelines. Come December of this year, we're going to be adding some additional indicators here. One is a PE assessment that was completed for the first time in the 18-19 school year will be wrapped in. Those 2 that I just mentioned about college and career readiness. We'll be looking at the number of flexible pathways that an individual school is offering. And then we'll have some ones that would be, I think, of particular interest to school boards based on per student expenditures and a yet to be exactly determined return on investment. This is going to be some sort of overall ranking or overall rating for the school, with a denominator that has to do with the amount of money that's being spent on per pupil. And then you'll see a number, at least on my screen. Hopefully they show up on your screen as well, as kind of an olive gray color there. There are a handful of indicators that are going to be coming from us. A school culture survey, climate and culture survey, and that is actually not going to be administered for the first time until this this coming school year, the 1920 school year. So it won't show up on the annual snapshot until December of 2020. So that's still about a year and a half out before we'll have all 20 of our indicators there. Again, that was a whole lot of information I just threw at people, so I'm going to pause for a second and see what sort of questions folks might have. I'll kind of toggle slowly back and forth between these two to let people look at them.
At this time, I don't see any questions.
Okay. If any pop up, I'm happy to come back and look at those. So I want to take a little look. This is what an individual school. We made this school up. There is no Birch Supervisory Union, but we thought it sounded nice and Vermonty to come up with something like that. And for anyone who knows their Vermont history, there'll be just a couple of Easter eggs thrown in here for your amusement. So, but this is just to show, you'll see that we've been looking at the Vermont snapshot, but when we look at a supervisory union or when we look at a school, they look almost exactly the same as the state one. We're asking the same questions of each supervisory union as we're asking of the state, and the same questions of each school as we're asking at the state level. So, you see the layout looks the same. A couple of differences that you might notice is that under, when you come to this page, you'll see the list of the superintendent and the address for the school, but also you could go to any of the schools within this fictional supervisory union. We're going to look at the supervisory union itself. Again, the layout looks the same, except when we were looking at the state before, now we're looking at the supervisory union. We're still able to do the same. You'll be able to drill down.
Patrick, can I interrupt one more time?
Please do.
Sorry.
No, please do.
So I know we're in this big transition now, redefining governance structures. And
yes.
How are you going to transition the data? And when are we going to be seeing only the operating structures as they exist?
Yes, that's a super question. Absolutely wonderful question. And it's a little bit tricky as people might imagine. Well, you'll see up at the top next to academic proficiency at the very top of your screen, it says 17-18. And as I mentioned, this is all data from 17-18 school year. It also represents organizational structures that as they existed in the 2017-18 school year. Come December of this year, though, you'll be able to, it's going to default to whatever the newest is. So it'll say 2018-19. You'll be able to click down and look at the 17-18 data. But what will be represented in the one that comes out in December of this year is both data, but also organizational structures from the year that the data came from. So for example, we've had some entire supervisory unions that have, 2 supervisory unions that have merged into one supervisory district. What we're looking at right here is strictly how that organization performed in the year that we have that data for. And then you will be able to certainly go forward and look at how whatever changes might have happened there. But what you can't do is if let's say again staying with Montpelier, right now we're looking at the Montpelier Supervisory Union. We could look at Montpelier Supervisory Union from 17-18, but not Roxbury Montpelier, which is the new supervisory district that exists between those two. In 2018-19 data, you would be able to look at Montpelier Roxbury, but if you wanted to look back at 17-18, you'd have to look at Montpelier and Roxbury separately, because the way that the data is presented is just based on how that organization existed in that year.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And we're actually hoping that it is data that really informs some of those Act 46 decisions that have been made in order to to look at what's going on.
Patrick?
Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Excellent.
Okay, the first one is there a way to see the school climate survey instrument?
So the school climate survey instrument is not fully developed right now, and yet it is also fully developed. The questions for the school climate survey are being taken from something that the U.S. Department of Education, along with the AIR, the Institute of Research, the American Institute of Research, I think is what they are, have jointly put together. So all of the different questions that exist there, they can be found. I can point you to them if someone's interested, and I can show you what those questions are going to be. And then I'm going to just scoot back a couple slides here. I know we're a little bit off, but then we're going to add a couple questions to that survey. For example, looking at how are staff judging the quality and the efficacy of the professional development, their evaluation systems, how are students looking at the usefulness of their personalized learning plans that are going to be in addition to the information that is in that climate survey. And I think a couple things are important that the schools will be getting, and will be linked from this snapshot, but the schools will be getting better and a deeper look at, I think the climate survey is broken into 4 different domains, and they'll really be able to dig down deeply here. Exactly what the snapshot is, again, going to be a little bit higher level look at the data for the climate survey, but there will be more information that individual schools will be able to get. And
Okay.
if you're interested in any of those indicators, I'm happy to provide them to you.
Great. And she also wanted to know if you know when the climate survey instrument will be available.
It's going to be administered this coming school year. I think they're finalizing the dates on it right now. I don't know exactly what those the dates are going to be. It's, like I said, it's in its final stages of development, and it's going to be at some point during the 1920 school year. I would guess that it's probably going to be January, February of 2020, but I'm not actually developing that, and I don't know that that's the exact date.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
School choice may be offered between elementary schools in your supervisor union. How might this reflect in the snapshot?
Yeah, great question. Really good question. So the way that the data is being displayed here is, thank you for that. And I will try to do my best. And if I fail to answer this fully, please ask a follow-up on it. The way that the data is being displayed is based on how the student is being paid. So that it really looks back at the individual the individual school. Well, actually, let me take that back. That's for independent schools. It's looking back at who's paying for that school to go there. If it's a public school, we're looking specifically at that individual school, and we're not breaking down where that student came from. But come December, we're looking at for students who go to independent schools, whether it's elementary or middle or high school, we'll be able to look back at who's paying for that school, so that if I am a school that, if I'm a non-operating district, or if I have school choice, I'll still be able to see the students from my school who our community is paying for, how are they performing? And really looking at those specific students, as opposed to saying, well, we know we have kids going to a variety of different schools, we'll really be able to see how our individual students from our community who we're supporting financially, how are they performing as opposed to looking at the 4 or 5 or 10 or 12 different schools that they actually might be attending. But that functionality is still in development and will for the independent schools, and will be coming out come December.
Okay, that's all the questions we have right now.
All right, great. So again, we're looking here at a particular, this mythical Birch Supervisory Union. You can see that this looks more or less like we did when we were looking at Vermont as a whole. The one difference would be you can see that both Birch and Vermont are displayed as opposed to before when we were just looking at Vermont. And and again, these are all made up data. Don't read anything into any of them, but they are all made up data for that. And similarly, you'll be able to look at a particular student group. The one that I'm pulling up here happens to be a student group that is very small for this school. I picked the Asian students, and you'll see that for Birch then, these locks show up. And the reason that these locks show up is so that, as I mentioned, that these are suppressed data. If I'd picked another group, we would have been able to see any other student groups. I mentioned in the beginning that if any group that's has fewer than 11 students is automatically suppressed, and that's again for student protection. And while we have it there, you'll see maybe if you look underneath the ELA reading, you'll see a scale of 13 students and a growth. This is a student enrollment or number of students who took the test for growth of 8 students. So 8 makes sense. That's fewer than 11. That's why it's suppressed. But you may be wondering then why would 13 students be suppressed? This comes up lots of times, particularly when we have small student populations in some of our schools, that we have what's called complementary suppression. And that's when you have to suppress one student group. By not doing that, you're revealing something about another student group. It sounds complicated, and it can be very complicated, but there's also a simple example for this. Excuse me, if we were to take an imaginary school of 15 students, one of those students was on an individualized education plan. Well, we'd report out all 15 of those students. We would suppress the data for that one student, because that would be telling something about that student, and that would certainly would be the wrong thing to do, and it would be illegal. But then we'd also have to suppress those other 14 students, and this is where that complementary suppression comes in, because if we know the performance of all 15 students, and we know the performance of all 14 students, we can figure out the performance of that one student of interest. So we do run into some times where we have what's called complementary suppression, and sometimes it can get a little bit strange the way that that things have to be suppressed, and it's not always satisfactory when we're looking at it as to why that can be. But there's a mathematical explanation behind it, and I think the important thing to know, it's always about student privacy and student safety is the reason that we're doing it. We've been looking at examples all of the public view, but administrators have the ability to look at suppressed data. So the public is only looking at unsuppressed data. I'm sorry. The public is looking at suppressed data. The administrators have the ability to look at unsuppressed data. So there's a login that they would have, and they would be able to see smaller student groups for that. And there may be lots of reasons that they might be interested in it. They may be looking at a particular grade level. They may be looking at a particular group of students. Otherwise, there's a logic to this. Superintendent has the ability to see unsuppressed data for all schools in her supervisory district or union, and a principal has the ability to look at all students within her school. A principal can't look at the unsuppressed data at another school. A superintendent can't look at unsuppressed data at another SD or SU. And in most schools systems, superintendent has also chosen to give an additional person, typically the curriculum director, access to look at unsuppressed data as well, just by having that. But and the public would not be able to see this. I am in no way a lawyer and not giving any advice on any of this. These would be questions that school board members, though, if they're curious about that, would really need to have those conversations with their superintendents and also probably with their council as to, is there an educational need to know this information for a school board member, which I don't know what that would be. I can't think of what that would be for those small numbers. And in that, there are some safety measures built in so that an administrator can't accidentally present to a school board or to a public meeting that unsuppressed data that would accidentally reveal information on an individual student. All right. I mentioned that one of the really big motivating parts of this was looking at those equity gaps. For example, we can look at this could be math, this could be English language arts. We can look at for a historically marginalized group, how are they comparing to a historically privileged group?
Patrick?
Yes, please.
I'm just mindful of the time.
Yes.
We're going on 7 o'clock, and I know this is a very important topic. I'm wondering, I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you want to race through it really quickly, or can we invite you back for part 2?
You know what? Let me just finish up this real quick piece on equity, and I would be happy to come back if there are further questions too. I think I've talked about this a lot, but I just want to make sure that people can see. We can look at this as an example of historically marginalized. How big is that gap between the historically privileged group? Again, instead of historically marginalized, we could be looking at free and reduced lunch. How big is the performance gap between students on free and reduced lunch compared to students who are not on free and reduced lunch? Or we can look at IEP, in this case, students who are, or we can look at an individual grade level. And I just wanted to mention that you can break it down to that level. How are 6th graders in whatever the state, your school, who are eligible for special education supports doing compared to other 6th graders who are not eligible for special education supports. So let me just finish up then by making this last comment and just saying that right now you can these are what a board member might ask to look at. Where are those gaps exist? What are trends that exist across grades and within a supervisory district or union? What are the needs and what are the strengths of those schools? What other data might we need? And then I think coming up with this December release, we'll really be able to look a little bit more into and as we have more data, how effective have the interventions been, and which investments have proven to be the most cost effective. And I think as we have more years of data, we'll really be able to hone in on a little bit more. And we said we were doing this thing for this reason. Are we actually seeing the results start to play out for those? And I'll just And finally, just to say, if you go to the snapshot and you click on the help button, there are a whole number of list of tools that exist there. There's an FAQ, there is a user guide, which is kind of a guided PowerPoint, an annotated PowerPoint that you'll be able to talk yourself through, look through. And then there are a number of videos that we have. There are 5 videos, each asking a particular question about the snapshot that could be shown at a board meeting or a committee for those who have board committee meetings, or a student, some sort of public forum as a way to introduce folks to what that snapshot would be. And with that, there's our website. It's snapshot.vermont.gov, schoolsnapshot.vermont.gov, and go look at it, spend some time playing around looking at your school, and if you have questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to come back to answer some of those and give more information as needed.
Patrick, thank you so much. I just want to take it from here and remind everybody that we are here as your support system, so please don't hesitate to reach out to VSBA. Patrick, we cannot thank you enough for this. It's been most insightful. I know we rushed you through a little bit, so thank you for sharing your contact information as well. And for those of you who have hung in there with us, we just want to thank you again for joining us this evening, and to thank you for serving on your local boards and representing Vermont's children so well. When you close out of here, you will receive a link to a 3-question evaluation. We hope you'll take a moment to fill that out, and we will be sharing with you all of the resources from tonight in an email, most likely tomorrow, since Carrie's leaving on a trip. So again, thanks to everybody for joining us. Patrick, we really appreciate your being with us, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.